You get that door for me? Not that one. That one. Welcome. I had some verses I wanted to go over today. And it's actually about 6 verses. Hey, open that door for me. Wow, right?
Should have seen it like 10 minutes ago. It's crazy. Amazing, huh?
Yeah. It's the winter sunsets in Laguna.
You want to close?
No, leave it open. There's one verse I want to discuss, but just the nature of it is that we're going to have to go through. Can I get a mic? You give me that mic? To not end up with an impoverished amount of context where you can't really make sense out of the verse in the best way, we kind of got to go through all 6 verses. It gives you the whole picture. There's one I want to focus on, but I think we're just going to read through the 6 verses. Austerity of the body consists in worship of the Supreme Lord, the Brahmanas, the spiritual master, and superiors like the father and mother, and in cleanliness, simplicity, celibacy, and nonviolence. The first 3 verses we're going to describe, or we're going to go through, they discuss tapas. Tapas is usually rendered as austerity, but austerity isn't necessarily the best translation. I think there's almost no one word that translates tapas into English. It's not a uniquely Indian conception. It's not like a word that only exists in Sanskrit and its derivative languages because there's no other culture that has the idea. It's just, it's not so commonplace in other cultures. And therefore, you have to take a paragraph or 2 to explain what tapas is. Does that make sense? Let me say it again. I don't feel like I'm super making sense. Sometimes you get words in a language and there's no other word for them in any other language. Like they have 30 different words for snow in the indigenous Eskimo language. I don't even know if that's true. They say that. I don't even know if it's true. They say that. But I do know this. I do know that in judo, you have any number of different words which are used for all the different types of trips. Whereas in wrestling, you don't have anywhere near the same amount of words used for foot sweeps. And so what's a fairly generic idea in Western wrestling of foot sweeps is a very, very detailed lexicon in judo because foot sweeps play so prominently into the art form. They're both wrestling forms. They're both ways you start from the feet and put your opponent on the ground. But because there's a variety of reasons. But anyway, judo is, you have to get your hips close to your opponent's hips. And it's almost like sumo wrestling in that capacity. But then you're allowed to use your feet. And so trips end up figuring more prominently into it. Whereas when you can lower your center of gravity and shoot, then other forms of takedowns like single and double legs are more prominent. But in judo, you're not allowed to grab below the waist, and so they use foot sweeps a lot, and so they have a whole language for it. So again, I don't know if there's actually 30 words for snow in Inuit. It's I read it on Instagram, so it must be true, but I don't actually know if it's true or not. I do know, however, that when you talk to people about something that they have a high degree of acumen in, and like a high degree of specialization in, they develop really complicated lexicons that seem laborious or seem overly detailed to an outsider. But for someone who's on the inside, there's a reason for all those different words. Like I'm assuming, Ryan, my friend in the back there, is a barista. You can close that door now, thank you. Ryan is a barista, so it means it's a fancy word for a coffee maker. I'm assuming there's all sorts of different terms, right, that are used in the coffee industry that I wouldn't know, right? I don't know what they are, but because I don't go to coffee houses, but you know, like half pump and full pump and double sweet and, you know, double shine, two-step and whatever. You've got some kind of language to explain how much of one particular caffeinated beverage or how the milk is mixed in and what that, you know, whether it's cold or hot or on ice and what the sweetness level of it is and flavor and how heavily the product is roasted, right? Am I on? There's a whole language. You're a coder. You actually have to learn, right? You're a coder? I mean, you write code. Come on, dude. You're killing me here. What do you do?
Engineering from more of a bigger hardware perspective.
Okay. Do you know how to write code?
Some, not company.
Okay. Anyway, if you know how to write code, it means you've learned another language. There's other languages you learn. Like it's not even that you just, it's not a specialized vocabulary, but it's actually an entire language that you use that allows you to do something. So anyway, tapas is not unique to Indian culture and Sanskrit and the Vedic peoples and such. It's not unique to them. But there is no simple word in English for tapas. So tapas comes from tup. And tup means it's a verbal root. All languages have verbal roots, but in Sanskrit, you actually study verbal roots as part of a routine study of grammar. So if you study Vyakaran or traditional Sanskrit grammar, then part of your study will be to study dhatus or verbal roots and how those verbal roots are changed with the addition of either internal changes or you add suffixes or prefixes, and they're formed into nouns and verbs. You follow? Like spectators, spectacle, right? They have something in common. What do they have in common? Spec, right? Which has something to do with seeing. That's a root. Does that make sense? So anyway, the verbal root, tup. Tup means to heat up, to cook. So tapas literally is something that cooks you. Now sometimes if you apply fire to something, what happens? It purifies it. So if water, for instance, is unpotable, it's undrinkable, one of the things you do is you boil the water, and through boiling the water you kill any microbes that might be in the water, and you purify the water for drinking. If you want to get really fancy, you can boil the water so much so that it turns into steam. You can then collect the steam, and that water is distilled. And that process of purification is so intense because the steam, the water transforms into gas, and I guess the steam somehow or other, the particles of matter aren't able to rise up with the steam, so they sit in the bottom. So even if you had sewer water and you boiled it, the steam from that is totally pure and drinkable. That's why they have these water purification plants. Like when you drive through Fountain Valley, sometimes there's a foul smell in the air for just a moment, because right at Euclid and the 405 freeway there is a sanitation plant where they take raw sewage and they turn it into drinkable water through a steam, I'm assuming a steam distillation process. So heat oftentimes purifies things or returns them to their natural state of purity if they've been adulterated or contaminated. And so the word tapas refers to voluntary austerities that are undertaken by an individual for the sake of self-purification. Therefore, the word austerity doesn't really do justice, because austerities are oftentimes undergone for political purposes. They're oftentimes forced. And both those elements are critical to an understanding of tapas, that you're voluntarily doing something which is difficult. That meaning is common. Austerity means you're undergoing some difficulty. And so you're voluntarily undergoing some difficulty for the sake of self-purification. But austerities are oftentimes enforced by the government. Like there was a hemp for victory movement in the 40s in the US, where farmers were forced to grow hemp on their farms in the US. It was a forced austerity measure. Do you know why they were forced to grow hemp? Because it was used to make ropes. So it was part of World War II, all hands on deck. And Greece had an economic crisis, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago at this point. But they had forced austerity measures. You could only withdraw so much money per day from the ATM or from the banks, because they didn't want there to be a run on money in the banks and for their whole banking system to collapse. So these would be, forced austerity measures where they're not voluntary. A draft is a forced austerity measure if you conscript people into military service, which we do in this country. The British conscripted Indians into military service in World War II. And they forced them to fight against the Nazis. But the British were the enemies of the Indians. But they forced Indian people, mainly Punjabis, they forced them into military service. And they were forced to fight against the Germans. I think for the most part, they fought in North Africa. And then when the Germans captured those British conscripted Indian soldiers who were forced into military service against their will to fight for a foreign power that had invaded their country and taken over their country, the Nazis they sent them to Singapore. And they trained to be part of the first Indian National Army. And they actually had to walk by land from Singapore back to India with Subhash Chandra Bose, who was killed in a plane crash. It was the leader of the Indian National Resistance. And by the time they got back home, they were treated very poorly. But this weird thing where the Nazis were actually befriended India because of the political principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they were trying to fight the British, and so they figured out a way to work with the Indians, who can't be faulted. I mean, they were forced into military service, and then they were brought back to train and fight for their homeland. Did you know about this? You know this, right? It's part of Indian history.
I knew about this. Western rebels, but what happened between Nazis and British?
You didn't know that. Yeah, they walked almost 4,000. You knew this?
No.
You didn't know this? Because you're younger. How old are you?
I'm 30.
And how old are you, sir?
I'm 51.
Because you're older. You would have studied in school, right? Yeah. Gradually you study these things less in school. But at your age, 100% you would have studied it in school as part of your education. Gandhi met with Mussolini. If you really want to blow your mind. Gandhi met with Mussolini. Anyway, you can be forced into military service. That force thing is not really tapas. Tapas has to be undertaken by you of your own volition. And it's not for political gain. It's for, at least it's not supposed to be. It's for self-purification. Although there's a little wrinkle in that. You're going to see that in a minute. So tapas from tup. Tup means to heat. Tapas is etymologically something that heats you up and purifies you, like you might cook gold. You heat up gold, and then the other alloys, if the gold is mixed with other metals, the other alloys will burn off and separate, and you'll be left with pure gold. Pure gold is a very particular shade of yellow. As you start to adulterate the gold with other metals, it turns into 22 and then 18 and then 14 karat gold. And it becomes correspondingly less valuable because 14 karat gold is almost half other metals. The other metals are practically speaking worthless compared to the gold, which is currently $1,700 an ounce. The other metals might be, silver, in contrast to gold, silver is $15 an ounce. So gold is literally 100 times more valuable than silver, what to speak of the copper and the steel and the other metals that they might mix in, which are even cheaper. So tapas is to cook, to purify yourself voluntarily. They got one word for that in Sanskrit, tapas. And so Krishna says, austerity of your body consists of doing puja to Deva, Dvija, Guru, and Pragya. It consists of doing worship to the wise, to your teachers, to the brahmanas, and to the Lord. Shocham, arjavam. It consists of cleanliness and integrity. Arjava means uprightness. Like the Arjun tree in India is a tree that stands straight up and down. It's like a very, very straight tree. And so Arjava means, it's the same word Arjuna, it's the same thing. It means the same thing. And so it means to be morally upright, to keep your promises, to have good character. Brahmacharya ahimsa cha, and non-violence and celibacy. Shariram tapa uchate. That is tapa of the body. Anuvega kadam vakyam. To be unagitating with your speech. Satyam priyam hitam chayat. And to speak what is true and what is beneficial and what is pleasing. Swadhyaya bhyasanam chaiva. And also to recite sacred texts. Van maya tapa uchate. That is the austerity of speech. It's a classic thing in Sanskrit. You'll break things down into not just to body and mind, but to body, mind, and words. You know how they say cognitive behavioral therapy? Cognitive is the way you think, and behavioral is the way you act. So we oftentimes divide things up into the way you think about something and the way you behave. In Indian philosophy, in the Gita, and other traditions as well, I think the Buddhists do this also. They divide the world up into the way you think, the way you act, and the way you speak. Because speech is an interim. You're starting to, if you're thinking about it, then you start to talk about it, you start to talk about it enough, and you start to do it. And so speech occupies this important juncture between thought and action. And so it gets its own category. So we've got austerity of the body, austerity of speech, and what's the next one we're going to have? Austerity of thought, yes. Mana prasada, keeping your mind peaceful. Prasad means peaceful. Prasad also is what comes off the altar, but prasad literally means peaceful, calm, tranquil. Mana prasad, keeping your mind peaceful. Somyatva. Somyatva. Somyatva means gentleness. Somya means like Soma. Soma means the moon. The moon is famous for its gentle rays, its gentle illuminating capacity. And Somyatva means gentleness, having a moon-like quality. Your mind is peaceful, you're gentle. Maunam means you're quiet. Atma vinigraha. Ava vinigraha means you practice self-restraint. So self-restraint, gentleness, peacefulness, and quietude. Bhava samshuddhir iti etat tapo manasam uchate. The austerities of the mind. It consists of these things and bhava samshuddhi, purifying of your existence. Now, if purifying of your existence was done with the body, would it be an austerity of the mind? No. So although purification of your existence would normally, in my mind, bhava means existence and samshuddhi means purification. Normally I would think that means like you take a cold bath or you're a vegan or something like that, but it's already been covered in austerity of the body. Ahimsa was already mentioned. Non-violence was already mentioned. So what you do with your body was already mentioned, what you do with your speech. And so we have to interpret this bhava samshuddhi, or purification of existence, as being purifying your thoughts, watching your thoughts, being careful what you think about. Does that make sense? These are the austerities of the mind. So you've got respecting your elders all the way up the food chain, celibacy, cleanliness, honesty, non-violence. That's your austerities of your body. The austerities of your speech, you speak what's truthful, pleasing, beneficial. You recite the Vedas, and you try not to agitate people. That's austerity of speech. And with the mind, the austerity is you're peaceful, you're quiet, you're gentle, you're self-controlled in your mind, and your thoughts are designed to be purifying. Simple living, high thinking. Simple living, behavioral, high thinking. Prabhupada used to like to say this. Simple living, high thinking. Behavioral, cognitive. Cognitive, behavioral therapy. Body, mind, and words. You see how they're trying to cover it all, right? Give you a complete package for you to use to better yourself. Does that make sense? You listened on the way down? You did? Yes. I don't need to catch you up? Okay. All right. Okay. Otherwise I was going to catch you guys up. So we've got this word, tapas, or tapasya. And that word generally is untranslatable as a single word in English, although we use austerity. But austerity can be forced and it can be for material purposes. And we like to talk about austerity as being something spiritual and also self-imposed. And so the word tapas doesn't quite translate austerity. So we have to add to it a little bit. And so you add to it a little bit and you get a better idea of what tapasya means, for 1 billion people. It's for 1 billion people. It's a big word for a culture of people. Tapasya. Anybody from India knows the word tapasya. Yeah? Of course you know it. Very common word. So we now have taken this word tapasya, Krishna has, and he said, hey, there's 3 ways of doing tapasya, and he's used a model of body, mind, and words. We have a kind of a smaller version of that with cognition and behavior, with thoughts and deeds. And it's just a little bit of a fuller version of it to include words as that juncture point. And Krishna's outlined it for us. Austerity of your body, be respectful of your elders. Be celibate. Be non-violent. And be clean and honest. Austerity of your speech, be truthful, pleasing, beneficial, unagitating, and in accord with the sacred literature. Austerity of the mind, this is all up here now. Be peaceful and gentle, moon-like, and quiet, and self-controlled, and with the goal of bettering yourself. And those are austerities of the mind. You got it? Then Krishna goes into another thing. He says you can actually do these three things in three ways. And we'll just roll through that quickly, and then we'll talk about what I want to talk about. These threefold austerities with body, mind, and words, when performed with transcendental faith by people not expecting material benefits but engaged only for the sake of the Supreme, that's the mode of goodness. That's sattvic. But when you do the austerities out of pride or for the sake of gaining respect, honor, and worship, it's in the mode of passion. When you want people to respect you and you're trying to get some benefit from it, then that's in the mode, that's a rajas. That's not the right austerity. Remember how I mentioned before that austerity is for self-purification, right? And of course, that's directly said in the definitions. But then there's this little tricky thing where those three types of austerities are performed in three different ways. You following this? And so if you're doing it for the right reasons, it's actually purified. If you're doing it out of pride or for the sake of gaining respect, honor, prestige, it's in the mode of passion. It's neither stable nor permanent. It's chalam. Chal. Chalo means let's go. It comes from chal, which means to move. Chalo means let's go. Chalo, chale. And so, it's from the same word, chal, which means to move. Achalam. Chalam. It's chalam. It moves. This austerity's move. It means it's not stable. It means you can't maintain it. It means you can't stay fixed. It means it's not permanent. Adruvam. You know Dhruva? Dhruva Maharaj, great king, Dhruva. Dhruva means fixed, firm, strong. So adruva, it's not fixed. It's always moving. Because when you don't get what you want, then you stop your austerities. Because you're not doing it for the right reason, so it's not going to be stable. Like I had a friend, she found out my brother died of a drug overdose. And she told me, I will never use drugs again. Then she used drugs again, and I had to rescue her. And I said, you promised me you would never use drugs again. And she said, but when I said it, I felt that way. I felt that way. You understand? But the whole purpose of saying, I'll never do this, means you're going beyond your feeling. Like you're married now, and you took a vow to be faithful to your wife. And so if you feel like being faithful, great. If you don't feel like being faithful, tough luck. You took a vow. The whole purpose of vows and contracts and commitments is that you do it even when you don't want to. Otherwise, you would just say, I feel like being faithful to you right now. That would be your marriage vow. I promise to be faithful to you for as long as I feel like it. Which essentially you don't have to say, because that's how the rest of the world operates. There'd be no need for vows at that point. You would just do what you're doing and then switch on a dime. We don't think about this, but you make a lifetime commitment. You take a vow, you make a promise. It's like there's a saying, like when you're a pro, it means you play hurt. When you're a pro and you're getting paid to play a sport, it's not like, oh, coach, I don't feel like it, my arm hurts, or it doesn't work like that. If you're getting paid and you're a professional, it means you play even when you don't feel like playing. That's your job. Like you don't call up your boss and go, I don't feel like working today. I don't feel like shipping off. Narayan's in the military. He's been to Iraq and other countries for military service. 2 times, 3 times? Twice. Been twice. They call it in theater. I don't know why they call it that, but anyways, I think in theater, I think it's like a movie playing in a movie theater. But that's what in combat means you're in theater. I'm sure that's the original usage of the term, and we co-opted it for movies, to be quite honest. But anyway, yeah, you don't get to say, I don't feel like it. My wife just had a kid. I want to stay home. It doesn't work like that. Even, if you want to get out of work, you have to be like, oh, I'm sick. I don't feel good. You gotta be careful about that now. If you start telling people that now, they're like, oh, can't come to work for 2 weeks, gotta get a COVID test. We can't mess around anymore. Employers can't mess around. You start reporting to them that you're feeling sick, it's like those days are over. And you get into quarantine mode. You gotta be careful when you're deploying your sick days. I'm sick, but I definitely don't have COVID. I feel really sick. How are you sick? Oh, I got a bad headache. You got to find something that's on the list. If you're not going to do it even when you don't feel like it, then there's no need to make any kind of a promise, because everybody's just doing whatever they want to do anyway, and then you do it for as long as you want to do it, and then you stop, and it's just kind of like the way the world works. Like if somebody's at your restaurant and they're sitting down, when they feel like leaving, they leave. Or if you're in a park and you want to leave, you leave the park. You have to say, I will stay in this park until I don't feel like staying here anymore. It's just assume. That's a default. So as soon as you start to make a commitment, that means even if I want to leave, I'm not going to leave. So these austerities are meant to be performed as part of your basic lifestyle. And when it's in the mode of passion, when it's just done for getting some respect or gaining some advantage, then as soon as you don't get that anymore, you stop performing the austerity. You give up your commitments. There are many people most people are like this. Most people are like this. They jump around. And while jumping around, they make commitments. They're cheap people. Srila Prabhupada, when his devotees started breaking their vows, he was bewildered. And he said, even a gentleman, he means like a meat-eating, like British person, or just like an atheist. Even a gentleman keeps his promise. Like you're supposed to be a devotee, you're supposed to be a Vaishnava. You made a commitment and now you're not keeping it. But even like just an average person on the street, just a semi-respectable, not low-class person, if they make a promise, they keep it. People don't realize this, but if you're divorced in India, people look at you like you are a criminal. Like you're like a meat eater. Or it's considered to be so abhorrent that you would make a promise and then not keep it. Like you should rather die than break your vows. Isn't it? The Indian people in the back are all nodding their head. They're all like, yes, 100%, that's how we feel. We have some American friends, they get divorced, and we think they must not be human beings or something like that. There must be something wrong with them. Like if you abandon your children or something like that, like just left them and left. That's how it's looked at if you walk away from your vows, from your commitments. Sometimes why Indian people hesitate to get initiated. Because they would never dream of doing that unless they were ready to commit and never break their promises. There are exceptions, but the divorce rate in India, even today, is 1%. Versus about 50% in the US. Thank you. So, if your austerity is just for something for yourself, it's not going to last. You got to go to a deeper place if you want to finish the race. If you want to sustain, you have to go to a deeper place. The whole giddy, excited, it's fun, you got to drop that. You got to go to a deep place. Then your commitments stay. And everybody pretends they're deep. Then you get in the deep end, you find out who can actually swim in the deep end. Everybody would tell you I could swim in the deep end. You get in the deep end, and all of a sudden people were drowning, and you got to pull them out of the water, and then I guess you couldn't after all. Put me in, coach. So you can see here in Krishna's language that he does not appreciate or think very highly of austerities which are not permanent, which cannot be maintained. Honestly, the move to adulthood is in many ways the ability to make commitments and keep them. Children are not expected to make commitments and keep them. Children are expected to just say something because it feels good and then change their mind. But if we want to be taken seriously, you have to be able to make it. And we, of course, don't trust each other so much, we sign contracts. Because we assume that everybody's going to break their words, and so you got to sign a contract which is designed to make it painful to break your word. And if you really want to get into it, contracts usually, if they're serious contracts, they think of every possible contingency because they have to assume the worst. They're designed to assume the worst. The whole thing of a prenuptial agreement, I've always found hilarious. A prenuptial agreement is agreement that one spouse doesn't get the other spouse's money if they divorce. So it's like, hey, we're going to make a lifelong commitment to each other. But on the front end, let's plan for it not working out. If you've got those doubts, maybe you should hold off on getting married for a minute. It's like a dangerous contract you're entering into there. If you got to, you know what I mean? It's funny, but I just read an article today on a woman. Trigger warning. I just read an article today on a woman who she wrote an article, and she's 30 years old. She was violently raped when she was a teenager, and got pregnant, and didn't realize she was pregnant because she went kind of crazy as a result of being raped, and only discovered she was pregnant 8 months into her pregnancy. At the same time, they discovered that her baby had a congenital brain defect, although it wasn't quite clear in the article because her incredible malnutrition might have contributed to the birth defect. And she's saying she wishes she got an abortion. But she was in Alabama where they didn't allow for late-term abortions, and her kid was born and only lived for 1 year and was blind from birth and could hardly eat and had seizures every day and could hardly breathe on their own, had a whole host of diseases, and and died after a year. And then she finished her article and she was like, this is why I think it's important for a woman to have a right to choose. You don't know what I've been through. You want to pass judgment on me, but if you sit across the room from me and you hear my story, I'm not sure you'd be able to pass judgment on me. And so, this whole abortion laws against abortions, late-term abortions are criminal because it was traumatic for my child to have to be born and suffer for a year and die. It was traumatic for me. And it was, it was a crime. And so women should have the right to choose. It was a pro-choice, which is, the pro-life, pro-choice. It's like you try to make the people who are into abortion murderers, and you try to make the people who are into regulations on abortion draconian and like trying to be, thought police or something like that. So I read the article, and my reaction to it was, by the way, did you guys notice the sleight of hand in the article? If you found her argument compelling, then the fact that she was raped and the fact that her kid was going to be born and then die of a congenital brain defect, those mean she should have been allowed to have an abortion. You follow? But she didn't say that. She said a woman should have a right to choose. But a woman have a right to choose means she can choose in any circumstance, even when these two factors aren't there. But if that's what she wanted, then the fact that she was raped and the kid had a congenital heart defect are irrelevant, because they shouldn't be factors if you want women to be able to choose anytime what they do. Did you guys follow that? So she used these details because they were significant, but then at the end, in her conclusion, she ignored the details and wanted a blanket right to choose. Did you follow that? A quarter of the world's abortions are performed in the U.S. Anyway, like for a lot of people in the world, Prabhupada one time said, he said, they'll throw their babies in the trash can. What surprises you about what they do? Talking about Americans. They're even throwing their baby in the trash can. What won't they do? Like from an outsider's perspective, somebody moves into your apartment and it's the winter or it's COVID, you're not allowed to evict them. We just put a moratorium on evictions. They're called squatting laws. They exist all over the country and all over the planet. And in many places where it's cold, if a family moves into your vacant apartment, you can't kick them out until the springtime, because there'd be a high likelihood they'd freeze to death. These are called squatting laws. Even if somebody illegally gets in, you can't get rid of them. We just decided, like this year, 2020, for the first time in my life, if somebody's living in an apartment and the COVID happened and they all lost a job, you can't kick them out. For a whole year, no rent required. It was great because the landlords were like, well, they should have saved up. And then the tenants were like, well, you should have saved up. Because why isn't it just the lowest rung on the ladder? Why is it just that the lowest person on the food chain should have saved their money? How come the rich landlords with the big fancy apartment buildings shouldn't have saved up to pay their tenants rent during that month? You follow? The argument works just as well both ways. So if a life takes shelter in your body, why don't they get squatting rights? We're not saying, you got more rights for COVID. You got a year. We're just asking for 8 months. Well, I'm going to have stretch marks. Tough luck. Well, I might die in childbirth. That's something, if that's actually a risk, sure. But that's a lot different than the majority of reasons people get abortions. Again, this is an example of people getting involved in something and then wanting to jump out of it. You take a vow, you make a commitment, and then it's inconvenient. And you don't want the ramifications, and so you just try to throw those things away. That's what happens to the austerities of people when it's just for material gains. There's no higher reason. There's no deeper reason. You don't last. You never last. You have a change in heart, and you just want to throw it all away, and you don't care about the ramifications. It's interesting, we always want to say, like, oh, well, they're divorced. Well, she was being abused or he was being abused in a relationship. That's not the majority of the time. That's not the majority of the cases. We can have some rules in place for that. You could also compare that to the harm done to the children in the case of a divorce. Because those children are cursed as a result of their parents getting divorced. Anyway, we should learn the lost art of making a promise and keeping it. We should become the kind of people who give their word and then keep it. Who make a vow and then keep it. Who make a promise and then keep it. Where our word becomes our bond. Where people can trust us because we say what we mean and we do what we say. Only people in the mode of goodness can maintain austerities, can maintain a spiritual lifestyle, can maintain the kind of things we're talking about. Otherwise, as soon as it's a little difficult, people cut and run. They're fair-weathered friends. So anyway, there's also an element of passion and an element of ignorance, which I'm not going to get into. What I wanted to get into today, with the remaining time we have, is I noticed something in this verse about mental tapasya. Normally, when I think of being peaceful in mind, okay, and being gentle, I was just counseling somebody today, and they told me they were up all night, they were in anxiety about something that happened. And they were saying how they got all spun out because of something that happened. And I said, you got to protect your consciousness more than that. You can't just let everything spin you out and keep you up all night. And they said, well, it's Krishna's fault. He made me this way. It's like the amount of poor logic I encounter on a daily basis is like I practically need a full-time assistant just to keep track of all the poor logic that gets deployed on me every day. Well, Krishna made me that way. I said, you're aware that argument could be made by a rapist or a child molester or a murderer to justify whatever they did because Krishna made me that way. And you're totally giving up any responsibility you have for the way you choose to cope with life whatsoever. Like, you're aware of how ridiculous that sounds. And like, yeah, but it's hard. I'm like, okay, great, it's hard. That doesn't mean you have the power to choose what you're going to focus on. That's your responsibility. One of the things I really like about this verse about mental austerity is it points to how much power we have to choose what we want to think about. What's your opinion on this? You know what? I don't have an opinion on that. It's like not my business. I don't want to have an opinion on that. Like, why do I have to have an opinion on everything? Maybe I have to have an opinion on some things that pertain to me, but other stuff that's going on, that's your business. I don't have an opinion on it. You follow? And we think of things like peacefulness and tranquility and gentleness as being qualities you either have or you don't. Like somehow you do X, Y, and Z and then magically you become peaceful. You do X, Y, Z, like you chant your japa or you're celibate or you're vegan, and then automatically you become peaceful. There may be things you need to do. But there's another piece of the puzzle that I think gets overlooked. If you want to have a peaceful mind, you need to practice having a peaceful mind. You need to practice being non-reactive. You need to curate your thoughts. You need to decide what's worthy of giving your attention to. You need to learn the lost art of controlling your mind. Just like you got to control your words. Just like the words are that little sweet spot that nobody notices in between actions and thoughts. We also don't notice how important it is to take responsibility for your own mental state. You want to be peaceful? Work on being peaceful. Practice being peaceful. Practice being gentle. Practice having uplifting thoughts. Practice high thinking. Do the simple living to free you up to practice the high thinking with a lot of gusto, with a lot of eagerness, with a lot of perseverance. If you're too busy trying to enjoy materially, then you won't have the energy to focus on controlling your thoughts. Krishna says, Shamadama tapa shocham kshantir arjavam eva cha jnana vijnanam astikyam brahmakarma swabhavajam. He says the activities of the Brahmana are tranquility and forgiveness and peacefulness. they're mental activities. He also says honesty and self-purification and cleanliness. There's also physical activities. But some of the activities you're supposed to perform are mental activities. You are responsible for the quality of your thoughts. A lot of times you got to curate your feed and take responsibility for that. That's part of it. You also have to take responsibility for your thoughts. And not just like be a blind consumer who before they consume is careful to turn on the right station on TV. And then you open up and just suck it all in. Even when you're out there moving around and there's all sorts of different stuff going on, you're responsible for the downward spirals you go down, for the negative thoughts you cultivate, for the things you hold on to. I think for most people, at least for myself and the people I counsel, this is a eureka moment. And I think it's interesting how this whole idea is just assumed in this text of the Gita. Tapasya is used. It's a word that people are familiar with. If you're reading the Gita, then you read Sanskrit, and you understand the word tapasya, and you understand the context of what Krishna's saying, and you have a knowledge of what that specific word means. I took some trouble to explain it to everybody. And then Krishna introduces this kind of novel idea that austerity is not just of the body, but it's also of the mind and also of the words, and it can be done in 3 different modes, and what's sustainable and what's not. It really paints you a picture. But what I thought was interesting, nifty even, is that austerity of the mind and the responsibility we have to execute mental restraint and to think about the right things and to choose what we're going to think about, that it was assumed that we all understood that that was a thing. Because for most people, at least here, it's like somebody else's fault. The devil made me do it. Like, oh, I watched that thing and that's like messed up and I had bad dreams. You follow? A, don't watch it. That's number one. And then B, if you can't not watch it because it's like at your workplace and something like that, you can't get around, then you have a responsibility to not focus on it. You're not just responsible for the stuff that's like coming at you and like to turn the right channel on and then just like open your mind up like a vacuum cleaner and suck it all in. You're also responsible to filter what you're going to choose to accept when you're in this world and stuff's coming at you from all sides. And that peacefulness of mind isn't the result of spiritual practice. It is itself a spiritual practice. Let me say that again. Peacefulness of mind is not merely the result of spiritual practice. It is actually a spiritual practice in and of itself. Gentleness of mind, uplifting thoughts. Again, I gave an elaborate explanation of bhava sangshuddhi, of purifying your existence. Because it's in the category of mental stuff, we should assume that means having uplifting high thoughts, cultivating uplifting high thoughts, cultivating a peaceful mind, cultivating a gentleness of mind, a quietness of mind. Mauna is quietude. But it can't be pure quietude because then it would be in the section on speech. It's a mental quietude. It's a mental peacefulness. It's a mental gentleness. It's a mental uplifting thoughts. We have a responsibility to perform that austerity, of cultivating that, of putting our time into doing that for the right reasons. Physical austerities and verbal austerities can be performed for the wrong reasons. Mental austerities are never performed for the wrong reasons because it's all internal and nobody else sees it, so you can't do it for the wrong reasons. I mean, I guess I could probably think of a way to do mental austerities for the wrong reason, but for the most part, when you get into the mental game, it's much more likely to be for the right reasons. And so in the Gita, regularly, in multiple places, Krishna speaks about Brahma karma, the work of Brahmanas, the work of saintly people, as consisting of being peaceful, equipoised, tranquil, and forgiving. These are things you can cultivate. You can force your mind to do the right thing as much as you force your body and words to do the right thing. And there's probably room in there for venting and decompressing and having confessions and spilling your guts. But it's like we think that's all you're supposed to do. You kind of maybe curate your feet a little bit and then spill your guts, and you're just able to just suck in whatever's coming your way like a vacuum cleaner. That's not the gig. You have a responsibility for what you think about. I thought that was powerful. I also thought it was implied. And so I wanted to kind of just flesh it out and put it on display a little bit. And so you could see what a revolutionary, powerful, cathartic idea. What a dangerous idea. How much responsibility it creates. I think we're all done. We'll do a little kirtan now, and then we'll have prasad. Thank you very much, Hare Krishna.